The day Beatrice Talbot fired a warning shot over the head of Clarence Hodge, the richest cattle baron in Harrow County, the whole town of Dellwood, Texas, finally understood that the widow on the hill was not lonely. She was simply done. It was the spring of 1882, and Dellwood sat low in a valley carved between red bluffs and dry riverbeds that ran silver with water only when the rains were generous, which was not often. The town had a livery stable, a general store run by a man named Prout who measured flour like he was measuring gold dust, a saloon called the Red Spur, and a church whose bell had cracked the previous winter and had never been replaced. Most of the people who lived in and around Dellwood were cattle people or farming people, and the distinction between those two groups mattered enormously to the people who belonged to each of them. Beatrice Talbot had been a farming woman and a cattle woman both, because her late husband, Thomas Talbot, had refused to choose just one kind of life. Thomas had died 14 months before the spring that brought Clarence Hodge riding up Beatrice's dirt road with a bouquet of yellow wildflowers and a silver watch chain he'd polished until it caught the sun. Thomas had been a good man, patient and large-shouldered, a man who taught himself to read at age 22 and spent every quiet evening thereafter with a book open on his knee. He had died of a fever that took him in a week, quick and merciless the way fevers were in those years, and Beatrice had nursed him through every one of those 7 days without sleeping more than an hour at a stretch. When he was gone, she had sat on the porch steps for 1 full day and 1 full night, and then she had gotten up and fed the horses and begun the work of keeping everything alive. She was 31 years old when Thomas died. She was 32 when Clarence Hodge came up her road with his flowers and his watch chain, and by then she had already turned away 7 men who had come with varying degrees of romantic intention. There had been Bill Osgood, who brought a smoked ham and told her she looked like she needed someone to manage her land. There had been young Preston Farr, who was only 20 and had been dared into it by his friends and could barely make eye contact. There had been 3 men whose names she'd already half forgotten, men who had seen a widow with 140 acres and a working well and a small herd of cattle, and had seen not a woman but a property arrangement. And there had been the Reverend Dale Whitmore, who had come in the guise of pastoral comfort and ended the visit by suggesting that a woman in her position ought to have a man's guidance in spiritual matters as well as practical ones, at which point Beatrice had shown him the door with a courtesy that was barely distinguishable from coldness. Clarence Hodge was the 8th. He was a broad man with a red face and more money than he knew how to spend quietly, and he arrived in a wagon that cost more than most families in Dellwood earned in a year. He handed her the wildflowers at the gate and told her she was the finest-looking woman in 2 counties, which was probably true, but was a remarkably poor way to begin a conversation with someone who had already heard that line from several of his predecessors. Beatrice took the flowers, smelled them politely, and then said, in the level voice of a woman who has made a decision and is not interested in renegotiating it, that she appreciated his kindness, but that she was not available for courting, not now, and she did not foresee that changing in the near future. She handed the flowers back with a smile that was genuine in its warmth and absolute in its finality. Clarence Hodge was not accustomed to being told no by people who did not own more land than he did. He pressed on. He told her about his ranch house, which had glass windows on 3 sides. He told her about his herd, which numbered over 2,000 head. He told her about his future plans, which involved a railroad spur he was in talks to have extended. He had the anxious, determined energy of a man who was accustomed to solving problems with money and had not yet been forced to develop any other tools. Beatrice let him finish. Then she said, quietly and without particular drama, that she was going to go get her rifle now, not because she intended to shoot him, but because she found that having it in her hands made the nature of a refusal clearer to people who struggled with clarity. She went inside, came back with a Winchester that Thomas had kept oiled and in good working order, and she fired a single shot at the sky, well above and to the left of where Clarence Hodge was standing. The sound was enormous in the still spring air. Clarence Hodge got back in his expensive wagon and left at a pace that suggested he had somewhere else to be. The story traveled through Dellwood and out to the neighboring county of Mercer the way stories always traveled in small places with few diversions fast, and with embellishments added at each retelling. By the time the tale had done one full circuit, Beatrice had supposedly held the rifle at Hodge's nose and told him she'd sooner marry her fence post, which was not exactly what happened but was not entirely inconsistent with the spirit of it. After that, the suitors stopped coming. The men of Dellwood and Mercer County reached a collective, unspoken conclusion that Beatrice Talbot was either too difficult, too independent, or too uninterested, and since all three amounted to the same practical outcome, they moved their romantic attentions elsewhere. Beatrice did not notice their absence and did not mourn it. She had her land and her animals and her two children, Clara, who was 9, and James, who was 7. And she had her own 2 hands, which she had discovered were capable of more than anyone had previously suggested, including herself. She hired a farmhand for heavy work, an old Comanche man named Running Deer who had lived in the area for decades, and who worked in exchange for a steady wage, and the use of a small outbuilding he'd made comfortable over several years. He spoke limited English, and Beatrice had learned, out of necessity, and then out of genuine interest, enough Comanche words to communicate with him clearly about the work. He was good at his job, quiet in his manner, and he treated her children with a gentle seriousness that Beatrice appreciated. He had his own grief, his own history, and the land between them was one of respect rather than easy friendship, though over 2 years it had become something warmer than simple employment. It was on a Tuesday in late May of 1882 that Eli Dalton rode into Dellwood. He came from the north, which was unusual, most travelers arriving from the south or east where the roads were better, and he rode a dark bay mare that moved with the steady, unhurried gait of an animal that had covered long distances and was not troubled by them. Eli himself was similarly unhurried. He was 34 years old, lean in the way that a life spent mostly outdoors makes a person lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were calloused and competent-looking. He wore a plain coat, nothing special, and a hat that had seen rain and sun both and bore evidence of neither with particular complaint. He had no particularly remarkable feature except that his eyes, which were a dark, quiet gray, had the look of someone who had learned to see things at distance before deciding what to do about them. He stopped at the Red Spur not for a drink, though he had one, but to ask about work. He was not a man who made conversation easily, but he was not unfriendly. He told the bartender, a man named Holt who had the information distribution instincts of a town crier, that he was looking for steady work, that he was good with horses and fences and cattle, and that he was not looking for anything permanent. Holt told him about Beatrice Talbot. Not in the way of a matchmaker. Holt was smarter than that and had watched enough men get the picture already, but in the practical sense. He said there was a widow woman up on the northern ridge who'd been managing her place short-handed for over a year, and that she'd been asking around about someone who could handle horse work specifically, since her farmhand was getting on in years and the horses were getting away from him. Eli finished his drink, paid for it, and said he might ride up and have a word with her. Holt said, casually and informatively, that she'd run off the last 8 or so fellows who'd come calling, the most recent with a rifle shot above his ear. Eli said with equal casualness that he wasn't coming calling, he was coming looking for work. He rode up to the Talbot place in the late afternoon, when the light was going amber over the red bluffs, and the air had cooled to something almost kind. The farm was modest but well kept in a specific way, the kind of kept that shows effort rather than abundance, where every small repair has been made that could be made and a few that couldn't have waited have been attempted anyway. The fence lines were patched with different colors of wood, new boards beside weathered ones. The garden beside the house was planted in straight rows and already showing green. The barn was clean. Beatrice was in the paddock with a young roan gelding that was giving her trouble. The horse was sidestepping and tossing its head, and she was working him in a slow circle on a long lead rope, her voice low and even, her movements measured and deliberate. She had her hair up and her sleeves rolled, and she was entirely focused on the animal and not on the man who had pulled his horse up at her gate and removed his hat. She noticed him after another full minute, which was not an accident. She had heard him arrive. She simply chose to finish what she was doing before she acknowledged him, because she was tired of men who expected her to drop everything the moment they appeared. Eli waited. He did not call out, did not shift impatiently in his saddle, did not do anything except wait with the particular quality of stillness that some people have and most don't. His horse dropped its head and began pulling at the thin grass near the gate. Eventually, Beatrice walked the roan to the paddock rail and tied him off. She walked toward the gate without particular hurry. "I know who you are," she said when she was close enough. "You're the man Holt sent up. Or the man Holt told about, which amounts to the same thing." "Eli Dalton," he said. He did not extend his hand over the gate, which she noticed. "I heard you were looking for someone who could work with horses." "I'm not looking for a suitor," she said, not unkindly but with the absolute clarity of someone who had delivered this message many times and had refined it to its essential form. "I'm not a suitor," he said. "I'm a man who needs work and who heard there was work to be had." She looked at him the way she looked at a horse she was about to decide about thoroughly, without pretense. He looked back without flinching or smiling or doing anything that suggested he was performing for her benefit. "That roan you were watching me work," she said. "What would you do with him?" He looked at the paddock. "He's got too much energy and not enough to do. He needs longer sessions and probably a stronger bit for now, and he needs to know somebody isn't going to get angry at him when he acts out. He's not mean, he's bored." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "That's an accurate read. I've been around a lot of horses. Wage is $2 a week and you eat at my table if the work is done and done right," she said. "I've got a bunkhouse, small, one man. The other man already living here is running deer and he'll have been here longer than you, which means his word on the ranch work carries weight equal to mine. You have a problem with that arrangement. This conversation is over." Eli said he did not have a problem with it. "Then put your horse in the near paddock and come meet running deer before the sun goes all the way down. You can start in the morning." She turned and walked back toward the barn, and Eli got down from his horse, opened the gate himself, led the mare through, and did exactly what she'd told him to do. The first 2 weeks were nothing more than what they appeared to be. Eli worked with the horses. There were 5 of them, the roan gelding, 2 working mares, a quarter horse that Beatrice used for riding, and an old gray that belonged more to the children than to any practical purpose. He fixed 3 sections of fence along the eastern property line. He helped running deer repair the roof of the barn, where a winter storm had loosened several boards and let in light in places light was not wanted. He worked hard and quietly, and did not ask questions that weren't about the work. He ate at the table in the evenings. Beatrice cooked plain, good food, beans and cornbread, occasional beef when she'd slaughtered, dried apple pie on Sundays because Clara had asked her to make it, and she decided it was a reasonable Sunday tradition. The children were at the table too, and they were the ones who initially drew Eli into conversation, because children in the West in those years did not stand on ceremony the way adults felt obliged to, and had no patience for the careful distance the adults were maintaining. James, who was 7 and deeply interested in horses in the way that small boys are deeply interested in large, powerful things, asked Eli within the first 3 days how many horses he'd broken. Eli thought about it seriously, which James appreciated, 40 or so, he said. Maybe more. I stopped counting when I stopped being surprised by it. Were any of them mean? James asked. A few. Mean or scared, which looks the same from the outside. James considered this. What's the meanest horse you ever met? Black thoroughbred up in Missouri. Belonged to a man who'd been rough with him for years. By the time I got to him, he didn't trust a single human being and had good reasons not to. Took me 3 months and he never was what you'd call easy, but he got to where he didn't try to kill anyone. James was delighted by this. Clara, who was 9 and considerably more composed in her curiosity, asked, in a way that sounded casual but wasn't, whether Eli had children of his own. Beatrice looked up from her plate. No, Eli said. He did not elaborate, and his tone was not sad exactly, but it was the tone of someone who has answered a question that touches something real and is choosing not to show the whole of it. Clara seemed satisfied with the answer for reasons that were her own. She went back to her food. Beatrice looked back down at her plate and said nothing, but there was something in the set of her jaw that had changed, very slightly, in a way that would have been invisible to anyone not paying close attention. The month of June came in hot and dry, as June in that part of Texas generally did, and the work was relentless in the way that farming and ranching work in summer always is. Beatrice was up before the sun every day and in bed only when she had to be, and there were evenings when she simply sat on the porch step after the children were asleep with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and looked at the dark valley below without seeming to look at anything in particular. Eli saw her there twice before he stopped pretending he hadn't. On the third evening he came out of the bunkhouse and sat down on the step of the porch, not close enough to intrude, and he didn't say anything for a while. The night was full of cricket noise and the distant sound of cattle settling. "You don't have to keep me company," she said, not unkindly. "I wasn't thinking of it as keeping you company," he said. "I just wanted to sit outside. It's hot in the bunkhouse." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It had the texture of two people who had been working hard in close proximity and had gotten past the awkward edges of each other's presence. "Running Deer told me you're from Kansas originally," she said. "He told you that. He doesn't talk much, but when he does talk it's usually about something that matters. He seemed to think it mattered that you'd come from far." Eli was quiet for a moment. "I grew up in Kansas, Abilene, then a ranch outside Dodge City for 7 years. Then I moved around some." "What made you move?" Another pause longer. "My wife died," he said, 4 years ago. I didn't want to stay in one place for a while after that." Beatrice set her cold cup down on the step beside her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. They were even in their grief, both of them, and they both knew it, and neither of them tried to say anything more about it than needed saying. Sometimes that kind of understanding arrives quickly between two people who have carried the same weight. July brought a problem with the cattle. 3 of Beatrice's small herd, she ran about 40 head, had been found dead on the southern end of the property, 2 of them near the creek. At first Beatrice thought it was the water, which could go bad in summer, but Running Deer looked at the carcasses and told her, in the mix of English and Comanche that had become their working language, that these animals had not died of bad water. He showed her the marks. Something had been into the herd, and it hadn't been a natural predator. Beatrice rode to town and spoke to the sheriff, a slow-moving man named Garrett Cole, who was not incompetent but was not particularly fast either. He came out the next day and looked at the cattle and agreed that it was suspicious and said he'd ask around. He asked around. Nothing came of it immediately. 3 more cattle disappeared the following week. Not dead, gone, which was worse in a practical sense. Eli rode the property line with Beatrice the following morning. They went out just after sunrise, the light still soft and long across the grass, and they rode the entire eastern fence line and then south and then west along the creek. Beatrice knew her land the way you know something you've walked over in every kind of weather, and she noticed things about it that Eli cataloged through her commentary. A break in the southern fence that was not an accident, being too clean a cut, and boot prints in the soft earth near the creek that were fresh and belonged to 2 men, maybe 3. "Someone's been taking cattle," Beatrice said, in the flat tone of someone stating a fact they're angry about but are choosing to approach with logic rather than anger. "That's what it looks like," Eli agreed. "Garrett Cole isn't going to move fast enough to be useful." "Probably not." "So what would you do?" she asked. It was not a question she would have asked any of the men who had come up her road with flowers and watch chains. It was a question she asked because he had been on her land long enough to know it, and because she had noticed, in the quiet practical accumulation of those weeks, that he was a person who thought before he spoke and whose thinking tended to be sound. Eli looked at the fence cut, then at the boot prints, then out toward the southern horizon where the Mercer County land began. "I'd fix the fence visible and clear so anyone watching knows you've found the cut which closes that route, and I'd move the cattle to the north pasture which is harder to access quietly, and then I'd stay up a few nights and watch." "That's what I was thinking," she said. "I don't like that you and I were thinking the same thing." "Why not?" "Because it means trouble is real and not imagined, and I'd rather have been imagining it." They fixed the fence that afternoon, and they moved the cattle, and for the next 3 nights Eli and Beatrice took turns keeping watch from the top of the south bluff, where you could see across the lower pasture and down to the property line. On the second night of watching, it was Eli's shift, and nothing happened. On the third night it was Beatrice's shift, and at approximately 2 in the morning she saw lantern light moving along the southern fence line. She came and woke Eli, which required knocking on the bunkhouse door and saying his name quietly, and she was aware, in a peripheral sort of way that she chose not to examine, how easily and quickly he came awake, how he was dressed and moving within seconds, how there was no fog in him. They went to the bluff. The lantern had stopped moving. Below, 2 figures were at the fence line. Beatrice said, loudly and clearly, in the carrying voice of a woman who has spent years calling children and animals across distances, "This is private property. I am armed and I am watching you. If you are on this land in 5 minutes I will send for the sheriff and give him your descriptions." The lantern went out. The figures were gone in under 3 minutes. In the morning Beatrice rode to town and told Garrett Cole everything in specific detail. She told him about the boot prints, the fence cut, the dates the cattle had disappeared, and the 2 figures she'd seen the previous night. She told him that she believed someone from the Mercer County side of the southern line was responsible, and she told him that if he did not act, she would begin keeping a written record of every instance with dates and times, and would submit it to the county judge directly. Garrett Cole, who was not a bad man, only a slow one, looked at her with the expression of someone who has been made to understand that they have run out of the commodity of time, and he said he would ride to Mercer County before the week was out. He did. He came back with 2 names and enough evidence that the county judge eventually got involved, and the 2 men, a pair of brothers who had been running a small and disorganized rustling operation across 3 properties, were arrested that August. Beatrice recovered 11 of her 23 missing cattle. It wasn't all of them, but it was enough. The evening the news came about the arrest, Beatrice made something better than ordinary for supper. She made a proper stew with the last of the dried corn and fresh onions from the garden, and a piece of beef she'd been saving. And she opened a small bottle of bourbon that had been sitting on the high shelf since Thomas's birthday the year he died. She poured a small measure into 2 tin cups, and she and Eli sat on the porch and drank it after the children were in bed, and Running Deer had gone to his outbuilding and the farm was quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for the help with the cattle business." "That was your doing," he said. "You saw the fence cut. You confronted them on the bluff. You went to Cole and pushed him into moving. You were there through all of it. That's what you're paying me for." She looked at him sideways. "That is not entirely what I'm paying you for." He was quiet for a moment, then the corner of his mouth turned just slightly. It was the first thing that looked like a smile she had seen from him in 2 months of close proximity, and it changed his face in a way she found, she noted, and then immediately set aside unexpectedly pleasant. The summer grew older, and the nights cooled in increments, and the work shifted from its frantic summer character to the somewhat more forgiving pace of late August. The children were growing comfortable with Eli in the way children grow comfortable with anything good and consistent, gradually, and then thoroughly. James followed him around the paddock for hours asking questions about horses that Eli answered with patience and without condescension. Clara was more reserved, but she had begun leaving small things in front of the bunkhouse door. A smooth river stone, once, a bird feather once, a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth on a Sunday without explanation, in the way that children show approval that they're not yet ready to articulate. Beatrice watched all of this with the careful attention of a woman who had been responsible for other people's hearts for a long time, and who understood that her children's growing attachment was not a small thing. She thought about it for several days before she did anything about it, and then one evening she found Eli at the paddock fence watching the roan, who by this time was a different horse, calmer, more connected, reaching across the fence rail toward Eli's hand in the particular way horses do when they've decided someone is trustworthy. "I need to say something to you," she said. He turned from the fence. "My children are becoming attached to you," she said. "That is not a complaint. I want to be honest with you about it. They lost their father 14 months ago, and they are not fragile. They are good children, but they have a father-sized space in their lives, and they're 7 and 9, and they can't help filling it with whatever's available." He was quiet. "I'm not saying this to put anything on you," she continued. "I'm saying it because I want you to know that if the work dries up or you want to move on, I need enough warning to prepare them. Not because you owe me that, you don't, this is a work arrangement, but because I'm asking." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" Not challenging, genuinely asking. He looked at the roan horse for a moment, then back at her. "My wife's name was Ruth," he said. "She died of a bad birth. The baby didn't survive either." He said it with the particular directness of someone who has learned that the quickest way through pain is straight through it. "After that I moved around for 3 years. I didn't stay anywhere long enough to put down a nail. I didn't want to put down a nail." He paused. "I'm telling you that so you understand that I know what it is to lose people, and I know what it is to need warning. I won't leave your children without it." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. The evening was soft around them, the light going gold and then amber, the roan horse shifting in the paddock. "All right," she said. "Thank you for telling me that." She went back to the house, and Eli turned back to the fence, and neither of them said anything else. But something between them had changed. Some level of surface that had been maintained by mutual unspoken agreement had become permeable, and now things could pass through it in both directions. September came, and with it came the harvest work and the beginning of the cattle preparations for the season. And there was so much to do that there was hardly time to think about anything except what needed doing next. Beatrice worked alongside Eli and running deer through days that started before light and ended after dark, and the closeness of this work, the working side by side, the small coordination of two people managing the same task, built something between them that had nothing to do with anything being said. It was in the way she handed him a tool before he reached for it. It was in the way he knew, without being told, that she wanted the northeast pasture checked before the south because she worried about the fence there. It was in the small, accumulated knowledge of someone's rhythms and habits and preferences that forms in the body before the mind has caught up to what it means. One evening in the middle of September, Clara fell. She was climbing the fence of the upper paddock, which she had been told not to do, and she came down wrong on her ankle and sat in the dirt with the stunned expression of someone who has hurt themselves and is deciding whether to cry about it. Eli was closest, and he reached her before Beatrice did. He crouched down in the dirt beside her and looked at the ankle and told her in a level voice that it wasn't broken. He could tell by looking, but that it was going to hurt, and she could cry about it if she wanted to because that was a reasonable response to pain. Clara, who had not cried in front of anyone since her father's funeral, promptly burst into tears. Eli sat in the dirt beside her, in the dust and the fading light, and he did not tell her to stop or that she was fine or any of the things people say to children to make themselves more comfortable with the child's distress. He just sat there and let her cry and said, after a while, that she was doing all right and that being brave didn't mean not crying. It meant crying and still getting up when you were done. Beatrice had arrived by then, and she gathered Clara up and carried her to the house and wrapped the ankle in cloth and soaked it in cold water from the well. When she looked up from that work, Eli was standing in the kitchen doorway with James beside him, both of them having followed because the business of attending to someone hurt pulls people along behind it. Something moved in Beatrice's chest that she was not ready to name, and that she therefore chose to treat as simple gratitude, which it was, at least in part. That night, after the children were asleep and the lamp was turned low, she sat at the table and thought about Eli Dalton with an honesty she had been avoiding for some weeks. She thought about the fact that she had noticed, persistently and involuntarily, the particular quality of his hands when he worked, the care in them. She thought about the fact that when he was not present on the property, she was aware of his absence in a way that was different from the awareness of Running Deer's absence or the children's absence, a different texture of awareness. She thought about the way his voice sounded when he talked to the horses low and even, as though he had all the time in the world, and the way it sounded when he talked to James, which was the same. She thought about Thomas, who she had loved truly and completely, and she discovered that thinking about Thomas did not make her feel guilty about thinking about Eli, which surprised her. Thomas had been a good man and she had loved him, and he was gone, and somewhere in the months of hard solitary work, and in the evenings of refusing suitors, and in the accumulation of days she had apparently, without announcing it, made her peace with that. Not moved past it, you don't move past love like that, but made her peace with the fact that life did not end because one version of it had. She did not do anything about this. She went to bed. October arrived, and with it came a development no one had planned for. Running Deer's nephew, a young Comanche man named Two Bears who had been in the north for several years, arrived at the farm to tell his uncle that Running Deer's sister was ill and asking for him. Running Deer heard this, sat with it for 2 days, and then came to Beatrice in the morning and told her in their mixed language that he needed to go north. He did not know for how long. He was sorry to leave before winter preparations were complete. Beatrice told him to go and not to be sorry, and she pressed extra wages into his hand from the small cash reserve she kept in a tin box under the kitchen floorboard. Running Deer looked at the money, and then at her with an expression that was not easy to categorize, but that Beatrice recognized as something like the acknowledgement of genuine respect between two people who have worked hard together and understood each other better than the circumstances of their lives might have suggested was possible. He left with his nephew the following morning, and the farm was down to Beatrice and Eli and 2 children. The work increased by the volume of one man, and the pace did not slow to compensate. And so Beatrice and Eli were working together from before dawn to after dark, and the space between them, which had been maintained by the buffer of other people and other conversations, became impossible to maintain at the same dimensions. They were simply always together, at the barn, at the fence, at the table for meals, on the porch for the brief wind down of evening before exhaustion took them to their respective beds. One afternoon in late October, Eli was reshoeing the roan, who had pulled a shoe in the north pasture, and Beatrice was in the barn beside him filling the feed bins, and they were talking while they worked, talking the way they had learned to talk, which was honest and without performance, circling subjects that were real and touching them when it seemed right. He had been telling her about Abilene when he was young, about the cattle drives and the particular quality of chaos that descended on a town when the drovers arrived, the noise and the money and the violence that moved through it all like weather. He was a good storyteller in the way of people who don't usually talk much, economical and specific, not wasting words, which made the words he used feel weighted. "Were you one of those drovers?" she asked. "For 2 seasons, when I was 19 and 20, he said. "I thought it was the greatest life I'd ever live. I was probably right in certain senses. I've never been that awake before or since." "What made you stop?" "Got tired of moving," he said, which she knew was not the complete answer, but which she also understood was as much as he intended to offer on that subject for now. She handed him a horseshoe nail that had rolled out of his reach, and their fingers were briefly in contact, which neither of them mentioned and both of them felt, and the conversation continued without interruption, but with that small charged moment sitting in it like a stone dropped in water. The next evening, at supper, James asked with the terrible directness of a 7-year-old whether Eli was going to stay forever. Beatrice set down her spoon. James looked at her, then at Eli, completely untroubled by the enormity of the question he had just dropped into the room. Eli looked at his plate for a moment, then at James, then across the table at Beatrice, who was looking at him with an expression that was composed and calm and told him nothing about what she wanted the answer to be. "I don't know about forever," Eli said to James, "but I don't have anywhere I need to be." James seemed satisfied. Clara pretended to be very interested in her cornbread. Beatrice picked up her spoon again. But later, when the children were in bed and Eli had gone to the bunkhouse and Beatrice was alone in the kitchen with the lamp and the silence, she sat with the feeling of relief that had moved through her at his answer, and admitted to herself, with the honesty that solitude sometimes forces, that she had been afraid he would say he was leaving. The first frost came in early November, harder and faster than expected, and they lost some of the garden to it, the last of the late tomatoes, some squash that had been almost ready. It was not a disaster, but it was a loss, and Beatrice stood in the ruined rows with her hands at her sides and her face doing the contained expression of someone who is adding this loss to a list that is already long and deciding they will not be defeated by addition. Eli was behind her. He did not say anything consoling. He crouched down and pulled up one of the frost-killed plants and turned it in his hands and then said, practically, "The root cellar looks well-stocked enough. And the squash that's already in won't be affected." She turned around. He was crouching in the dirt looking at the dead plant with the same serious attention he gave everything, and something about the pragmatism of him, the complete absence of pity, the assumption that she would keep going and was simply assessing the situation, struck her with a force she hadn't braced for. "Eli," she said. He looked up. She did not know what she had intended to say. She stood in the frostbitten garden in the November cold and looked at him crouching in the dirt among the dead plants, and she felt something shift in her completely, the way a door shifts when a wind changes direction, something that had been held in place by habit and caution and the reasonable protection of a woman who had already lost one great love swinging open on its hinges. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He stood up, dropped the dead plant. "All right." They sat at the kitchen table with their coffee, and after a silence of several minutes that was comfortable and full at the same time, Beatrice said, "When my husband died, I told myself I was done with the whole business of needing someone. I meant it sincerely. I want you to know that." He waited. "The men who came up the road after him, they all wanted something from me. The land, the respectability, some kind of arrangement. They called it courting, and some of them were decent enough men, but they were looking at the farm, not at me." She looked at her coffee. "That's why I stopped letting anyone stay." "I know," he said. "Do you know why I let you stay?" He was quiet for a moment. "'Cause I didn't call myself a suitor," he said. "Yes," she said. "And because you were telling the truth, you weren't one. You were just a man who needed work." She paused. "And then you became something else, something I hadn't planned for." The silence between them was different now. It had substance. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I'm feeling," she said, with the directness of a woman who has decided that if she is going to move towards something, she is going to do it eyes open and honest. "But I am also not going to pretend it is simple. I have 2 children. This is my land, it was my husband's land, and I'm not looking for someone to take it over. I'm not looking for a man to manage me. I know that, he said, and the thing was she believed him because he had shown her over months in every small and practical action that he did. What are you looking for then? She asked. You told me you stopped wanting to stay anywhere. What changed? He was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them threw soft gold light across the table. Outside, the wind moved against the house and the frost was still on the garden and the night was full of cold. I think, he said slowly, that I stopped wanting to stay anywhere because every place I went reminded me of what I'd lost. And then I came here and it reminded me of what I wanted. He looked at her. You're the most capable person I've ever met, he said. Not just as a farmer or a rancher or any of that. You're capable of everything. Of grief and of work and of loving your children and of turning away the whole county when they're not what you want and of still being open to something real. I watched you with that horse in the paddock the first day I rode up and I thought, this woman knows how to be patient with something difficult. That's a rare thing. Beatrice's eyes were bright. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now, but something in her face had softened in a way that changed it considerably. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I'm not asking to live with you, he said. Not yet, I'm telling you what I feel. She reached across the table and took his hand, which was calloused and warm, and she held it for a moment and then released it, and she said, I think you should know that this frightens me. It frightens me too, he said. Good, she said. I wouldn't trust it if it didn't. What followed was not an explosion of feeling, but something more like the slow and careful crossing of a river, testing each stone before committing weight to it, moving with intention rather than momentum. They were both people who had been burned by fast things and who had learned to trust the slow. There were evenings on the porch where the conversation moved freely and then stopped, and they sat in comfortable silence listening to the night sounds. There were mornings in the barn where their shoulders were close together over some shared task, and neither of them moved away. There was a Sunday afternoon when the children were playing in the yard and Beatrice was sitting on the top porch step reading, and Eli came and sat beside her. Not at the end of the step, but beside her, and she moved over slightly to give him room and then did not move any further, so that they were sitting with their shoulders barely touching, and she turned another page without looking up, and neither of them said anything about it. He kissed her for the first time in November, on an evening when the temperature had dropped sharply, and they'd been to town for supplies, and the wagon wheel had cracked on the road back, and they'd had to manage it in the dark with cold hands, and a lantern and 2 children wrapped in blankets on the wagon bed complaining about being cold. When they finally got the wagon home and the children inside and the horses settled, they were standing in the barn in the lantern light, both of them wind-chilled and tired, and Beatrice was laughing. Not at anything specific, at the accumulated absurdity of the evening, the cracked wheel and the dark and the cold and the whole impossible business of keeping everything going. She was laughing and he was looking at her laughing, and then he took a step forward and put his hand against her jaw and kissed her, brief and warm, and then pulled back to look at her. She stopped laughing. She looked at him in the lantern light. Well, she said. Well, he said. She kissed him back, slower, her hands coming up to his chest, and the barn was warm and the night was cold outside, and the horses moved quietly in their stalls, and that was all that needed to be said about that. November deepened and December came, and with it a letter from Running Deer, delivered through a man who'd come down from the north. The letter was written in Comanche, and Beatrice was only able to read parts of it, but what she could determine was that his sister had passed, and that Running Deer intended to stay north with her family through the winter. He would return in the spring if she still wanted him. She wrote back immediately, in the small amount of Comanche she knew, supplemented by the Spanish she'd grown up speaking at the edges of, which she knew Running Deer could manage some of, that he was to take the time he needed, and that his place on the farm was his for as long as he wanted it. She sealed the letter and sent it back with the same messenger. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard in the way Texas winters could sometimes be, not consistently brutal but unpredictable, warm days followed by days of bitter cold and wind, and the uncertainty of it was its own kind of challenge. Beatrice and Eli managed the farm through it steadily, and the evenings had become evenings they shared in full, sitting by the kitchen fire after the children were in bed, talking or reading. She had a small collection of books, including the one Thomas had been reading when he died, which she had not opened since, and which sat on the shelf with the same dignity she'd have afforded a living thing. She mentioned it to Eli one evening, the fact that she couldn't open it, and he didn't say she should or that she would someday. He just said that some things earn their own place on the shelf and don't need to be touched. She loved him for that. She had accepted by December that she loved him. She turned it over carefully in her mind, the way you turn a well-made object in your hands to appreciate its construction, and she found it to be genuine and unperformative, and entirely unlike the careful, anxious feeling of the early months of her marriage to Thomas, which had been wonderful but had been tinged with the uncertainty of youth. This was something different, the love of two people who understood loss and had chosen to move toward something anyway, who came to it deliberate and clear-eyed, and with the full weight of their history behind them. She did not tell him immediately. She waited until she was certain that she was certain, because she was a woman who did not say things she did not mean. She told him on a January evening, the fire burning low and the children in bed, and the farm pulled in tight against the cold. She was sitting across the table from him and he was reading. He had borrowed one of her books, a collection of essays by someone who had been West and written about it, and she had been watching him read, which she did sometimes when he was absorbed enough not to notice. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "I love you," she said, plainly and directly in the way she did everything. He was still for a moment, and then something happened to his face that she had never seen happen before, something unguarded and young and essentially undefended, something that had been waiting behind all that competent quietness for a moment safe enough to emerge. "I love you," he said. And then, because he was who he was and because the plain, honest thing was always what he reached for, "I've loved you since September, I think. Maybe before. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to be one of the men who came up the road and ruined what we were building." She reached across the table. He took her hand. "You weren't one of those men," she said. "You never were." "I know," he said. "I was just a man who needed work." She smiled, and he smiled back, a full smile this time, both corners, the kind of smile that entirely remakes a face. And the fire popped, and the January wind moved around the house, and nothing about the evening was extraordinary except that it was entirely, completely, quietly what it needed to be. Winter gave way to February, and then March with the grudging reluctance that seasons in Texas had. And as the land began to soften and warm, there were practical conversations between Beatrice and Eli that needed to happen, and that they had both been moving toward. These were not romantic conversations. They were the plain-spoken discussions of two adults with shared commitments and a future that was real and would involve real decisions. The first was about the farm. Beatrice was clear. The Talbot land was hers. Thomas had worked for it and she had worked for it, and it would pass to Clara and James. Eli said he understood and that it had never occurred to him otherwise, which she believed, and which relieved something in her that she hadn't realized was waiting to be relieved. The second was about the children. This was more complex and they both knew it. James had, in the way of children who make decisions through emotion rather than reason, already decided that Eli was something close to a father, and navigating that was a matter of care and patience and honesty, with a 7-year-old who didn't yet have the vocabulary for the distinctions involved. Clara, who was 10 now and sharper, had watched the whole unfolding with careful eyes and had not said anything directly, but had stopped leaving things at the bunkhouse door, which was, Beatrice thought, because she no longer needed to communicate approval indirectly. She had simply folded Eli into her daily life with the thoroughness of someone who has made a decision. Beatrice spoke to both children together on a March evening after supper while Eli was at the barn. She told them that she and Eli cared for each other, and she told them what that might mean, and she told them both that their father had been their father and always would be, and that nothing changed that. She watched their faces while she talked. James said, with the focused pragmatism of someone who has identified his priority, "Does that mean he stays?" Beatrice said yes. James said good, and went back to the toy horse he'd been carving with a small knife that had been Thomas's. Clara looked at the table for a moment, and then at her mother, and then she said, with the careful articulation of someone who wants to be precise, "Papa would have liked him." Beatrice put her hand over her daughter's hand and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. When she could, she said, "Yes, I think he would have." Running Deer returned in April, as he had said he would, arriving one morning with a small pack, and a carved wooden token he placed in Beatrice's hand without explanation that she understood to be something from his sister's people, a gift of safe passage. He nodded at Eli, who nodded back, and Running Deer looked at the paddock where the roan horse was moving with an ease he hadn't had in the autumn, and something like satisfaction moved across his face, and then he went to his outbuilding and put his things away and came back to work. The spring was full of work and new life the way springs in good years always were. The calves were strong. The garden went in orderly and well. The roan had become a genuinely good working horse, calm and responsive, and Beatrice began using him alongside her quarter horse on the longer cattle runs. Eli had taught James how to hold a lead rope properly, and how to approach a horse from the right angle, and how to be still so the animal could smell him. And James practiced these things with a concentration that was entirely his father's, which made Beatrice both ache and love in equal measure. On a warm evening in May, almost exactly 1 year after Eli had ridden up the road for the first time, he asked her to marry him. He did not make a large production of it. He had thought carefully about how Beatrice would want to be asked, and had concluded that she would not want a performance, that she would want it said the way true things are said, directly and without excess. They were at the paddock fence, where they often ended up in the evenings, watching the horses settle for the night. He said her name, and when she looked at him he said, "I want to marry you, Beatrice, not because of the land or because it's practical or because I'm afraid of something, because I love you and I want to build a life here with you and with your children, and I want it to be real and permanent." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening was warm and the horses moved in the paddock, and somewhere behind them in the house she could hear Clara and James in their evening argument about who had to carry water in the morning. "Yes," she said, "simple as that." No conditions attached, because they had already had the condition conversations and she knew who he was. He took her hand and they stood at the fence for a while longer, not needing to say anything else. They married in June of 1883, which was not yet a full summer after Eli had first ridden into Dellwood, and the ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Whitmore, who had the good grace not to recall his previous visit to the Talbot farm, and who performed the service in the small crackbell church with something that looked genuinely like joy. Because, whatever his failures of judgment with Beatrice had been, he was not a man without feeling for the people in his care. The whole town of Dellwood came, which was natural enough since they were the primary entertainment Dellwood had produced in several years. Clarence Hodge did not come, but sent a somewhat stiff note of congratulations that Beatrice placed in the stove and did not miss. Holt from the Red Spur came and brought a bottle of rye whiskey as a wedding gift that was more genuinely welcome than any of the other gifts. Clara was the one who fixed Beatrice's hair that morning, sitting behind her mother at the dressing table and working the pins in with the concentrated care of someone performing an important service. She did not say much while she worked, but at the end, looking at her mother in the mirror, she said, "You look beautiful, Mama." Beatrice took her daughter's hands in hers and held them for a moment. "Thank you, Clara." James had insisted on wearing Thomas's watch, which Beatrice had kept oiled and running, and it was slightly too large for his wrist, but he wore it with enormous seriousness, and it stayed on through the whole ceremony, which was all he asked of it. Eli stood at the front of the church in his clean coat, the one he'd bought in town specifically for this occasion, and he looked like himself. No performance, no pretense, just the same steady-eyed, plain-spoken man who had ridden up the road with nothing except his skills and his honesty and his willingness to work. When Beatrice walked toward him down the short aisle of the Crackbell Church, he looked at her the way people are supposed to look at each other at the beginning of a life together, like he was seeing everything clearly and choosing it, all of it, without reservation. The vows were traditional and short, and they both said them in clear voices, and when it was done, the small congregation made the noise that small congregations make when something has gone right, and Running Deer, who was sitting at the end of a back pew in his best clothes, made no noise at all but watched with the particular quality of attention that means more than applause. The summer of 1883 was the best summer the Talbot farm had in years. The cattle were healthy and the market was good, and the crops came up well in the family, because that was what it was. It felt that way from the inside and looked that way from the outside, moved through the long hot days with the ease of people who are where they are supposed to be. Eli had moved fully into the farmhouse, which required some reorganization and the building of an additional room on the east side of the house, which he and Running Deer constructed together over 2 weeks in July, and which James decided was his room even before the last wall was up, announcing this with the certainty of someone who has made a decision and does not expect it to be disputed. It was not disputed. Beatrice found, in the daily life of having Eli fully present in the house, not the confinement she had feared, not the management she had refused from all those other men, but a genuine partnership of the kind Thomas had given her, and that she had not expected to find again. Eli deferred to her on matters of the farm because the farm was hers, and he knew it. She deferred to his judgment on the horses because his eye was better. In everything else they argued occasionally, productively, and resolved it, and when she was right he said so, and when he was right she said so, and the marriage had the quality of two people who respect each other enough to tell each other the truth. He was good with the children in a way that she could not have predicted from the outside, and had only been able to confirm by watching. He did not try to be Thomas. He made no move toward that, had never once suggested he was replacing something that could not be replaced, but he was present and steady and interested in them as people, in what Clara was reading and what James was thinking, and the children responded to this with the fullness that children give to people who truly see them. By the autumn of 1883, Beatrice was pregnant. She told Eli on a morning in October, early, before the children were up, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee and looking at the frost on the ground. She said it plainly as she said everything. "I'm expecting." He came up behind her and put his arms around her and held her against him, standing there at the window looking at the frost-covered ground, and they stood that way for a long time without speaking. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "I am," she said. "I'm not worried. I was worried with both of them, but I'm not this time. I don't know if that's foolishness or wisdom." "Maybe neither," he said. "Maybe it's just knowing yourself." She turned in his arms and looked at his face, which showed everything it always showed when he was moved, a contained radiance, the emotion held carefully but present all the way to the surface. "You're going to be a good father," she said. He held her face in his hands and did not answer right away, and she understood that the thing she'd said had touched something that needed time to be heard. "I'm going to try," he said. "Every day." James was thrilled when they told the children. He immediately announced that the baby should be named after his horse, which was called Copper, and that if it was a boy the name would be Copper Dalton, which would be a very good name, and if it was a girl the name could also be Copper. This proposal was gently but firmly declined. Clara, characteristically, said less but thought more. And that evening she came to Beatrice and said that she thought it was good, and that she thought James was going to be a terrible influence on the baby, and she intended to counterbalance this by being a good one, and that she hoped it was a brother because she already had herself for a sister and a brother would be more interesting. Beatrice laughed, really laughed, the way she hadn't in years, the kind of laugh that lives in the chest and comes from somewhere deep and genuine. Running Deer, when told, was silent for a moment, and then he went to his outbuilding and came back with a small carved figure that he placed in Beatrice's hands, and she recognized it as a protective carving, a thing given in sincerity, and she thanked him in the best Comanche she had, and he nodded as though the matter was settled. The winter pregnancy was not easy in its physical details, but Beatrice managed it the way she managed everything, with practicality and without self-pity, adjusting the work as she needed to, accepting Eli's insistence on taking the heavier loads without making it into a negotiation. She rested when she was tired, which required some relearning of habits, and she ate carefully from the well-stocked root cellar, and the months moved with the particular combination of slowness and speed that marked the approach of something expected. The baby came in May of 1884, in the early morning before sunrise, and it was a boy. He was large and loud and entirely healthy, and when Eli held him for the first time, in the kitchen, in the lamplight, the neighbor woman who'd come to help sitting in the corner with her hands folded, Beatrice propped against her pillows watching him. There was something in his face that was nothing anyone would have a word for, just the pure and complete undoing of a man who had believed for 4 years that this particular door was closed, standing there with a child in his arms. In the kitchen of the farm that was not his but was home, he looked at Beatrice. She was looking at him, looking at the baby, and her face was everything she felt: love and exhaustion and joy and the specific tenderness of watching someone you love be undone in a good way. "What are we calling him?" she asked. Eli looked at the baby, who was working himself toward another sound, small fists moving. "I had thought William," he said, "if that's all right with you." "William Dalton," she said. "Yes, that's a good name." James, who had been awake and kept in the kitchen through the whole business by Clara, who had designated herself his keeper for the occasion, appeared in the doorway at the sound of voices. "Is it a boy?" he demanded. "It's a boy," Eli said. James looked at the baby with the studied, critical expression of a 7-year-old assessing a potential companion, and then he said, "His head looks strange." "Newborn babies sometimes look strange," Eli said. "You probably did too." James considered this deeply troubling information and then decided to believe his own head had been fine. Clara came in behind him and looked at the baby and then at her mother, and something passed between them, woman to woman, the first thread of that particular language, and Clara came to the bed and took her mother's hand and didn't say anything, which said more than anything she could have. The spring of 1884 was warm and generous, and the farm was alive with it. William grew the way healthy babies grow, fast and apparently in secret, suddenly larger each time you looked away. He had Beatrice's eyes, gray and direct, and Eli's coloring, and he had from his earliest weeks a particular quality of attention. He watched everything with concentration, which delighted Running Deer, who declared in his fashion that this one sees things. James began to be useful on the farm in the specific way of boys who are old enough to carry real weight and young enough to consider it an honor rather than a burden. He was 8 by then and could handle the roan on a lead and could carry water and mend simple fence breaks, and he did all of this with a seriousness that Eli encouraged and Beatrice cherished because she could see Thomas in it, the same careful attention to the task, the same pride in doing it right. Clara was 11 and reading everything that crossed her path, including the newspaper that came through occasionally with the supply wagon, and she had taken to asking questions about the world beyond Dellwood that were pointed and specific and occasionally inconvenient. She asked Eli once why Indian people were forced off their land and whether that was legal, having been listening to a conversation between her mother and Running Deer that she was not supposed to be listening to. Eli said that whether it was legal and whether it was right were two different things, and that the distinction between those two was one of the most important things a person could learn. Clara wrote this down in the small journal she kept, and Beatrice, who had seen it happen, said nothing, but felt something swell in her chest that was both grief for the world and love for the people in her kitchen. Running Deer stayed through the summer of 1884 and into the fall, and by the time November came, he told Beatrice that his North family needed him again. His sister's children were young, and there was no one else of the right generation, but that he would come back in the spring, and if she didn't need his work he would simply like to visit, if that was acceptable. Beatrice said that he would always have his room and his wages if he wanted them, and that even without either, the door was always open. He left with his nephew again when the nephew came through, and the parting had the warmth of people who will see each other again and know it. Dellwood changed in small ways over those years, as small towns do. A new family came and built a house on the southern end of town. The general store got a second set of shelves and a coffee grinder. The cracked bell in the church was finally replaced by a new one that the congregation had collected for over 2 years. Beatrice and Eli were part of the fabric of the town in the way of people who don't seek prominence but earn it. The woman who had turned away every suitor in 2 counties had found the one who didn't call himself a suitor, and the story had become, over time, a kind of local legend told with affection rather than gossip, the way good stories should be. By the spring of 1885, William was a year old and pulling himself up on everything that stood still long enough, and James had turned 9 and had started to show a real aptitude for horses that went beyond enthusiasm into something that looked like genuine talent. Eli had begun teaching him in earnest, not the lead rope and approach work of before, but real horsemanship, the weight and balance of it, the language of pressure and release that tells a horse what you need. Beatrice watched them together in the paddock in the long spring evenings, Eli's voice carrying across the fence, patient and specific, and James on the back of the old gray horse working his hands and his seat with a concentration that made him look, for moments, uncannily like Thomas. She had stopped being startled by how both things could be true at once, that James was Thomas's son and felt it in his bones, and that he was growing up shaped by Eli's presence as surely as he was shaped by everything Thomas had given him. The two things were not in competition. She had learned that love did not work in competition. Beatrice was expecting again. She had told Eli in March with the same plain morning window announcement as before, and he had held her the same way, and the joy in him was the same but larger now, because this time it was familiar. He knew what it meant, the whole curve of it, and knowing made it more rather than less. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and the birth in November of 1885 was quicker and less dramatic, which the neighbor woman said was the grace of a second child, and what she'd said about a third as well if it came to that, which made Beatrice laugh in the middle of labor, which was an achievement. This child was also a boy, and they named him Thomas, which Beatrice had decided on alone and told Eli with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought about something for a long time. Eli said it was a good name and that Thomas would have approved, and Beatrice said she thought so too. 2 boys and a girl and a farm and a working marriage, and 20 acres of new fence that Eli and James had spent the summer building along the northern property line, expanding the grazing land and adding value to the place that would belong to Clara and James and William, and now Thomas someday. The work was never done, the way good work never is, but it was their work and they did it together. And there was a difference between work that exhausts you and work that fills you even as it tires you. The winter of 1885 was cold and quiet, And the house was full in the best way, loud with children and warm with the fire and rich with the smell of food cooking, and the sound of two adults talking in the kitchen after the children were asleep. The low, serious conversations about the ranch and the future, and the occasional book and the occasional memory, shared carefully, from before each other, from the lives they'd each lived and lost and found their way through. Eli told her once, on a December evening with the fire low and Thomas asleep in his small crib, and William asleep on his pallet and James and Clara in their rooms, that he had ridden into Dellwood that first May without a particular plan, just a direction, and that the whole turn of his life from that point felt like it had been arranged by something he didn't have a name for. Beatrice said she was not inclined toward that kind of thinking, generally speaking. He said he wasn't either, generally speaking. She said, but I'm glad I came from the north instead of the south. Nobody comes from the north, she said, nobody except you. He looked at her across the quiet room, and she looked back at him, and the house was warm and the children were asleep, and the farm was still under its winter skin, and the next day would begin before light with the ordinary beloved work of keeping it all alive. The year of 1886 brought Dellwood its first properly organized cattle market day, which the ranchers in both counties had been discussing for years, and which had finally been organized by a committee that included Beatrice, who had been asked to serve on it because she had, by this point, the reputation of a person who got things done without losing her temper or her precision. She rode to the organizational meetings with Eli, who came not as an advisor but because he enjoyed the ride and was curious, and who sat in the back of the meeting hall and said nothing until the third meeting, when he offered a logistical suggestion about the order of sale that was so practically useful that the committee adopted it unanimously, and then he went back to sitting quietly in the back. Beatrice said to him on the way home that it was becoming more and more difficult to claim the full credit for things when he kept quietly being useful, and he said that he was fine with her having the credit. He was just there for the ride, and she told him he was impossible, and he smiled the full corner smile that she had first seen in the lantern light of the barn, and that still, 3 years into knowing it, had the same effect on her that it had had the first time. The spring of 1887 was the first spring running deer did not return. A letter came instead, written in a different hand, his nephew's, she believed, explaining in halting English that running deer had passed in January, quietly in his sleep, in the house of his sister's children who had become his family. He had been old, the letter said, though no one knew exactly how old, and he had been at peace. Beatrice sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about the years of morning work beside him, the patient instruction of her inadequate Comanche, the way he'd looked at her frost-killed tomatoes with practical assessment and no pity, the carved figure he'd placed in her hands when she was pregnant with William, the way he'd watched the roan horse move in the paddock the morning he came back and found it a different animal. She told Eli, and he sat with her through it. She told the children, and Clara cried quietly, and James was silent in the way that meant he was feeling something he didn't have words for yet, which was the right response. She took the carved protective figure from the shelf where it had been since William's birth, and she put it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink where the morning light hit it, where she would see it every day, which seemed like the right thing to do. The farm went on. That was the nature of it. People came and went and the land continued, and you honored what had been by continuing, by doing the work well, by keeping faith with the place. In 1887, Beatrice turned 38, and Eli turned 40, and neither of them made a particular ceremony of it, except that she made him a proper cake with sugar frosting, which was expensive, and which she considered a suitable acknowledgment, and he said it was the best thing he'd eaten in 40 years of eating, which was possibly an exaggeration, but not by much. Clara was 15 that year, and already the person she was going to be, sharp and thoughtful, and principled in a way that sometimes made the adults around her uncomfortable, and always made Beatrice quietly, fiercely proud. She had finished everything that passed for a formal education in Dellwood and was reading her way through every book that came into the county, and she had expressed, with careful seriousness, the opinion that she would like to study further when she was old enough and that she thought there must be a way to do it. Beatrice said there was a way to do most things if you were determined, and that they would find it when the time came. James at 13 was already as tall as Beatrice and was going to be taller, and he had Thomas's quiet patience and Eli's eye for horses and some quality that belonged to neither of them and to himself alone, a straightforwardness with people that made them trust him immediately, a quality you couldn't teach and couldn't fake. He spent most of his days working the farm and the horses with the seriousness of someone who has already decided what his life is going to be, and that life was this land, these animals, this place. William at 3 was a personality in motion, loud and curious and completely without fear, constantly into everything, perpetually covered in something. He called Eli Pa without ceremony and had done since he could talk, and he called Beatrice Mama and James J. and Clara Clar and Thomas, when Thomas was old enough to interact with, was his favorite human being in the world, which Thomas tolerated with the resigned benevolence of a person who has been claimed by someone and decided it's fine. Thomas at 2 was his mother's child in appearance and temperament, both watchful, deliberate, not easily rushed. He studied things before touching them. He said fewer words than other children his age, and when he said them they were exactly the right ones, which made Beatrice think of Thomas Sr. in a way that was pure love with no pain in it anymore, only warmth. The summer of 1888 brought a dry spell worse than any Beatrice could remember in her time on that land, and the creek ran thin, and the cattle needed to be moved twice to find adequate grazing, and the garden required hand-watering every morning from the well in a line of buckets that Clara and James carried, while Beatrice and Eli managed the stock. It was hard and it was relentless, and there were evenings when they both sat on the porch steps too tired for conversation, just breathing in the hot, dry air, and the silence between them was entirely companionable. One evening in the middle of that dry summer, Eli said, out of no particular context, just speaking into the quiet, "Do you ever regret it, any of it?" She looked at him. "Regret what?" "Any of it, keeping the farm, sending Hodge up the road, letting me stay." She considered the question with the seriousness he had always given to things she asked him, which was what she gave him in return. "No," she said, "not a single thing, not even the hard years." "The hard years are part of it," she said. "You can't have one without the other." He was quiet for a moment. "I came up this road with nothing," he said. "No plan, no permanence, nothing to offer. I didn't come as a suitor. I came because I needed work." "I know," she said, "and you let me stay." "You let yourself stay," she said. "That's different. All those other men wanted something from this place. You wanted to be part of it. That's what I saw." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had reached across the table that January evening when she told him she loved him. The same hand that had been calloused and warm then, and was the same now, familiar and steady and entirely his. "I love this place," he said. "I love this family." "I know," she said. "We love you." The drought broke in September of 1888 with 3 days of rain that came in from the south and soaked the ground and filled the creek and turned the air cool and green-smelling. And Beatrice stood in the yard in the rain with her face up and her eyes closed and the water running down her collar. And for a moment she was only sensation, the cold rain and the warm air and the smell of the earth drinking. Eli came out of the barn and stood beside her and looked up at the rain and then at her and said nothing, which was right. The years built themselves, the way years do, each one slightly different in its specific texture but consistent in what mattered. The farm grew in small increments, more acres under fence, a second well, a proper smokehouse that Eli built in the autumn of 1889 and that James helped with and took genuine pride in. The cattle herd expanded to 70 head by 1890, which was the result of careful management over several years, and which represented the kind of quiet, unspectacular success that looks simple from the outside and is anything but. Clara left for further study in the fall of 1890, when she was 18, going to a school in San Antonio that took women and offered a serious curriculum. She left on a Tuesday morning with a trunk that she'd packed herself with ruthless efficiency, and she hugged James and ruffled William's hair and picked up Thomas and held him for a long moment with her cheek against his head. And then she hugged her mother and Eli separately, and she did not cry, being Clara, but she held on longer than the hug technically required, which was its own kind of eloquence. She wrote letters home every 2 weeks without fail. The letters were long and specific and full of observations about the world she was encountering, and Beatrice read them aloud at the supper table because they deserved an audience, and because the children needed to know that one of them had gone out and found something larger and was doing well in it. James, at 16, was running a significant portion of the farm's daily operations with a competence that was no longer surprising but was still satisfying. He had his father's name and his father's patience and his stepfather's education in horses, and the combination was formidable. He had also, by the summer of 1890, developed an interest in a girl from the neighboring property, a rancher's daughter named Mary Prout, that Beatrice watched with the particular combination of amusement and tenderness that parents feel when their children enter this specific territory. Eli noticed too, and said nothing to James directly, but made sure he was always very busy when James seemed inclined toward unnecessary moping, which was kind and effective and characteristically practical. William at 6 was in school in town, which required a morning ride that he regarded as the best part of the day, and he was already the kind of boy who could charm the room funny, energetic, with an instinct for people that made adults like him even when he was causing trouble, which was not infrequently. He had Beatrice's directness and Eli's stillness when he wanted to use it, and the combination was going to be something remarkable in 20 years, which everyone could already see. Thomas at 5 was his brother's shadow and opposite, quiet where William was loud, careful where William was impulsive, watching everything and storing it. He had already, at 5, the quality of someone who would grow up to think deeply about things, which worried Beatrice in the abstract way that the interior children always worry their mothers. But she watched him and saw that he was genuinely happy in his quiet way, and that was the thing that mattered. Beatrice turned 40 in 1889, which she marked by doing precisely nothing special, which was her preference. Eli took her out to the eastern end of the property in the evening, where the bluffs turned red in the sunset and you could see the whole of the valley and the town below, and they sat their horses on the ridge and watched the sun go down over the country they knew and had worked and which was theirs in every sense that mattered. 40 years, she said. You look 29, he said. That is a lie, she said without complaint. It's a loving exaggeration, he said. She laughed and they rode back in the dark, following the trail she'd ridden 100 times, the horses knowing the way. In the spring of 1891, Clara came home from San Antonio with a teaching certificate and a quiet, serious young man named George Harris, who was also a teacher and who looked at Clara with the particular expression of someone who has found what they were looking for and knows it. He was polite and intelligent and said very little on his first visit, which Beatrice recognized as composure rather than emptiness, and she approved of him in the careful way she approved of things that mattered, which was to say, thoroughly and with confidence. Clara stayed the summer and helped with the farm and spent long evenings on the porch with her mother talking about things that didn't get said during the working year. And at the end of the summer, she told Beatrice that she and George planned to marry and to teach in a town north of San Antonio, and that she would come home for Christmas and every summer if the roads were kind. The parting in September was harder than the first one because it was more permanent in its texture, and Beatrice held her daughter at the gate for a long time and said into her hair, "Your father would be so proud of you." Clara pulled back and looked at her mother and then at Eli, who was standing nearby, and she said, "Both of them." Beatrice looked at Eli and found him looking at the wagon and not at her, and she could see, in the line of his shoulders, that he was moved and managing it the way he managed everything. Quietly, inwardly, with full acknowledgement of what it was. James married Mary Prout in the spring of 1892, when he was 18 and she was 17, in the same cracked bell-replaced church in Dellwood, and the whole town came to that ceremony as well, which by now was simply what Dellwood did when the Talbot Dalton family had cause to celebrate. Holt from the Red Spur brought another bottle, better quality this time since he had upgraded his stock, and the reception was in the yard of the farm because there was no building in Dellwood large enough for the people who wanted to come. Beatrice danced. She had not danced since before Thomas had died, and she had thought in the years between that the part of her that danced had gone dormant. But the fiddle player was good, and the evening was warm, and Eli took her hand and she went, and they were not graceful but they were joyful, which is what matters. The farm by 1892 was a well-established, solvent working enterprise. The cattle numbered over 80 head. The horses were known in 2 counties. The land was fenced and healthy. Eli and Beatrice had been married 9 years, and the marriage had the texture of the best kind of long things worn smooth in the places where they'd rubbed against each other, strong in the places where they'd held together through pressure, comfortable in the daily way but never boring because they were both still people who were genuinely interested in things and in each other. There was an evening in the fall of 1892 when all of them were at the farm for supper. James and Mary, who lived in the small house James had begun building on the north end of the property, and Clara and George, who had come for a late summer visit that had stretched to October because Clara was expecting, and Beatrice had said firmly that she was not going back to San Antonio before that baby came. William and Thomas were at the table, and the house was full of people and noise, and the smell of food, and Beatrice stood at the kitchen window for a moment before bringing the last pot to the table and looked at all of them through the window glass. Eli came into the kitchen from the back and saw her standing there and came to stand beside her at the window. "Look at all of them," she said. He looked, James telling some story with his hands while Mary laughed, Clara sitting with her hand on her rounded stomach and George beside her saying something into her ear that made her smile. William at 11 dominating the conversation in the specific way of William, who had never met a silence he didn't want to fill, while Thomas at 9 sat beside him with the expression of someone who is listening to everything and saying nothing and absorbing it all. "That's a lot of life," Eli said. "Yes," she said. She took the pot to the table, and everyone moved and made room the way families do, and the conversation swallowed them up, and the evening went long into the night, the lamp burning low and the fire warm and the children eventually asleep on various chairs and corners while the adults talked on. Clara's baby was born in November of 1892 in the same farmhouse bedroom where William and Thomas had been born, and it was a boy, and they named him James Thomas Harris, which satisfied everyone involved considerably. The winter of 1892 was gentle, and the Christmas that year, with Clara and George still in the house and James, and Mary coming over every morning, and the 2 babies, James Thomas, and the knowledge that Mary was also expecting, which she told them at Christmas dinner with the particular proud anxiety of a first pregnancy. The Christmas was the fullest the house had ever been. Beatrice sat at the table that Christmas evening after supper, looking at her family, and she felt something that she recognized after a moment as complete. Not finished, there was always more, there would always be more, because life was not a problem that solved itself. It was a practice you kept at, but complete in the sense of rounded, of having arrived at something whole. Eli was beside her, their shoulders touching, and James was at the other end of the table with Mary, and Clara was nursing little James Thomas in the rocking chair by the fire, and William had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, which was William's way, and Thomas was drawing something in a small notebook by the lamp, serious and absorbed. "Beatrice," Eli said quietly. She turned. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the lantern light of the barn, that first November, the way she had found him looking at her 100 times in the years between, with the clear, unhesitant, entirely decided look of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. "I know," she said. "I didn't say anything yet," he said. "You were going to tell me you love me," she said. "I was," he said. "I know," she said again, and took his hand on the table and held it, the way she had held it across the kitchen table on a January night 10 years before when they were still learning the shape of each other. And the fire burned and the lamp glowed, and outside the Texas sky was clear and enormous and full of stars that had been there long before any of them and would be there long after. And the farm was quiet, and the family was home, and everything, finally and genuinely and without reservation, was well. The new year came, and the ranch expanded, and the family spread its roots, and the Talbot name stayed on the gate because Beatrice had always wanted it there. And below it, in new wood that Eli had added when James was born, were the words Dalton Farm, and both were true, and both were right, and neither contradicted the other, the way the best things never do. The widow who had turned down every suitor in 2 counties had built something that none of those suitors could have given her, because what she had built was not given at all. It was made, carefully and honestly, between 2 people who had each known loss and had chosen, with their eyes open and their histories intact, to build something new from what remained. And it held. It held the way good things hold when they are built right, not because nothing tested it, but because everything that tested it found it solid, and every year added to it rather than wearing it away. And the children who grew up in it carried it with them when they left and brought it back when they returned. And the land remembered every season of work and gave back accordingly. And the horses in the paddock were good horses, and the cattle were healthy, and the gate stood straight at the end of the road. And the name on it was theirs,